Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to From the Vault. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian at the South Carolina Historical Society. It's a brand new year here in the present. Happy 2025. But we are heading back to 1776 for some warmer weather. It's June in the order book of the 4th Regiment of South Carolina that we have been following, and it's just a few days before the Battle of Sullivan's Island here in Charleston. The troops are preparing because they know that the British are planning an attack and, in fact, have already begun landing on what is today's Isle of Palms. So before we get to the battle and the aftermath of that Patriot victory, which will also relate to a past podcast episode, let's hear some announcements. Join us for our 2025 winter lecture series called Untold Stories of the American Revolution. The winter lecture series will take place over 4 dates in February and March at First Baptist Church in Charleston in the evening from 6 to 7 p.m. We will also be live streaming these lectures for those who cannot attend in person. And you can find out all the specific topics for each lecture as well as get the dates for each one and get tickets at the news and events page of our website, schistory.org. And now let's talk about sources. In addition to the order book of South Carolina's 4th Regiment housed at the South Carolina Historical Society, we used Richard Hudson's letter book housed at the South Carolina Historical Society, the American Revolution Institute's website, papers of the Second Council of Safety of the Revolutionary Party in South Carolina, published in the South Carolina Historical and Genealogical Magazine, and Carolina.com. All right, let's head on back to 1776. And as a quick reminder, when I read the entries from the order book, you'll hear a parole word and a countersign word, which were the passwords to get into the forts or barracks or wherever the regiment was stationed at that point. Regimental General Orders, 14 June, Parole, Lawrence. The following order, that part of Captain Beckman's company now at barracks and the whole of Captain Drayton's, except such of each as may be on guard, are on the first alarm if made at night or on the first appearance if in the day of the enemy's ships being in motion, to repair directly with their respective officers now in town to Granville's Bastion, the south end of the bay, there to wait for further orders. Captain White's company with its officers are stationed at Lawrence's battery under the immediate direction of Major Elliott. Major Elliott will select 2 or 3 men of Captain White's company for making such a quantity of grape shot as he may have occasion for at his battery. The quartermaster is desired to take his men and bring 6 pieces of timber from any of the wharves nearest at hand that may serve as strong posts of at least 8 feet long and 8 or 9 inches diameter, which are to be placed behind the lines at Gadsden's. General orders by General Lee, 15th June. The Guard henceforth are to be composed of the following numbers: 1 field officer, 3 captains, 9 subalterns, and 200 rank and file are to form the main guard at the State House. So this is when the State House was here in Charleston, and the order book goes on to list other assignments for the wharves along the harbor, which gets a little confusing to listen to when you don't have a visual. So we'll kind of skip ahead over those, but the point of this entry is that they're getting assignments for where they need to head when the attack from the British begins. The guards are to turn out and rest their arms when His Excellency the President or the Major General walks by, but this only once a day to each. The brigadiers are to be received by the guards with shouldered arms. The Major General wears a blue ribbon as a badge of his rank, by which he may be known. The Brigadier General, a pink. Rounds are to go 5 times a night and are to be regulated in the following manner. The field officer commanding the main guard to go at 11. The main guard at half an hour after 1, 3, and the break of day. The countersign will be sent by the field officer of the day to the field officer commanding the main guard at retreat beating, who is to send it enclosed and sealed to the officers of the different guards. The countersign is one of those passwords that I mentioned at the beginning, and you may have noticed that this entry in the order book listed a parole word, but not a countersign as it has in the past. So this part of the entry clues us in on how heavily guarded that countersign was. And the next part of the entry mentions how it was used. No person, either military or resident of this town, to pass the sentries after 9 and tap 2 beating without giving the countersign. As another reminder, the tap 2 was like the taps of the day, indicating the end of the day and that theoretically, all soldiers should be either in their barracks or where they're stationed for the night. The commanding officers of the different corps, both regular and militia, are to order a party of their men to make up cartridges to the complement of 25 per man, those accepted who have powder horns instead of cartridge boxes. Mr. John Calvert at the arsenal will deliver them paper pack thread and lead upon application of the commanders of the corps. The men who have powder horns and shot bags instead of cartridges are to be furnished with half a pound of powder and a proper quantity of lead. For the future, no officer or non-commissioned officer commanding or superintending the working parties are to take away any orders but from the Major General, brigadiers, aide-de-camp, or brigade majors, who are to be known by a green ribbon. The 2 gentlemen that are appointed to act as brigadier majors are Major Connor and Major Simmons. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Bullitt, being appointed by the General Congress as Deputy Adjutant General for the Southern Department commanded by General Lee, is to be received, respected, and obeyed as such. Colonel Tacitus Gilliard is appointed to act as Quartermaster General. He is to be respected and obeyed as such. Countersign for this night is Charlestown. So they finally let us in on a countersign there. And I like the different colors of ribbon that are used to indicate who is who in terms of leaders, because it feels like the leaders change quite a bit. And obviously there are no pictures to circulate ahead of time. So the troops need a signal to know who they're supposed to be showing respect to and listening to when it comes to orders. So those ribbons indicate who's important around here. General Orders, Charlestown, 16 June 1776. Parole, freedom. The roll calling of every corps to be twice a day, at 8 o'clock in the morning and 5 in the evening, before the doors of the commanding officers of the different corps. At evening roll call, the general orders of the day to be read to the men and officers. Upon a fire breaking out in the town, the troops are not indiscriminately and confusedly to run to the fire, but to repair to their alarm posts. A copy of the following rules to be posted in every guard room. No officer must have his guard during the time he is on duty. Those that trespass this order will be immediately put under arrest and treated accordingly. The field officer of the main guard must not suffer above 8 men at a time to leave the guard, and then only for their victuals, and when they return he may allow 8 more men to absent themselves on the same account, but shall allow them no further time than what is absolutely necessary, so that the whole may have their time. For which reason, if they stay longer than the time allowed, they shall be punished for it on their return. Their punishment to be double duty during the time they are on guard. A quick note here, if you're not familiar, victuals means meals, that sort of thing. So if they needed time for their victuals, it meant they needed to go eat. To prevent any of the men asking leave just before their turn to stand sentry in order to escape that duty, the officer should always send a sergeant or corporal before he gives any man or men leave, that he may inform him when the man may be wanted. He must also order the sergeant to put down his or their names with the hour they went and the time allowed, that he may know whether they have been punctual or not. Patrols are to go every hour of the night from the beating of the tattoo to the reveille. So the reveille was the sort of morning call, the wake-up call that it's daytime and the nighttime is over. Our normal daytime operations can now continue. So the order book then details some of the patrol routes, including areas that we would recognize still in Charleston today, like Broad Street, Gadsden's Wharf, which is near the International African American Museum today, to the Governor's Bridge, which crossed a creek on East Bay, and on George Street from the barracks, which were located near where Randolph Hall is today on the College of Charleston's campus, to St. Philip's Church. These different patrols to prevent disorders and any number of people assembling together. Likewise, to oblige all those who keep public houses to send away their guests at the law prescribed by His Excellency the President. This line about the public houses shows us a piece of how everyday life was altered during this time because of the proximity of this war. It wasn't just soldiers who were preparing for this conflict. The livelihood of residents, like those who ran inns and boarding houses, was affected as well. They had to send away their patrons and, in effect, their money-making prospects while this battle was ongoing. This was done in the name of safety, obviously, but it had a real impact on the people who lived in Charleston at the time. When the patrols are challenged by the sentries, they are to answer patrol and specify the guard thereof. For instance, patrol of main guard. As soon as a patrol returns, the sergeant is to make a return to the officer of everything that happened during his patrol and what prisoners he has brought to the guard, that he may examine them himself and set down their names in writing, the time and the reason of their being taken up, their place of abode, if townsmen or soldiers, their regiment and company they belong to, all of which must be inserted in the morning report to the commanding officer of the main guard. So again, if regular residents weren't following the rules, they could be arrested by soldiers who were patrolling. It's something to think about today that these soldiers, even if you were also a patriot supporting America's independence, could take you into custody for not following the rules prescribed for wartime. The officers commanding the different guards are to send reports of the occurrences of the night to the officer commanding the main guard, who is to make a general report to His Excellency the President and to the general. The field officer of the day may choose what hour he pleases to go the rounds. The guard, consisting of 1 captain, 3 subalterns, 4 sergeants, and 72 privates ordered yesterday to be posted at the Parsonage Church, must instead of that place be posted at Mrs. Garrard's in Ansonboro at the head of Meeting Street. Countersign for this night is Victory. Regimental orders. Lieutenant Hurd must visit the batteries at Pritchard's and Falaud's and report to the commander of artillery whether the platforms are yet laid or not, as soon as possible. Colonel Roberts expects the quartermaster will call on him at 5 o'clock in the morning, every morning. I can't remember if we've talked about what a quartermaster is before, but even if we have, it's probably worth revisiting since we mention it here. The job of the quartermaster was to provide what the soldiers needed, like equipment needed, tents if needed, animals like horses and oxen, and lots of other different supplies, basically logistical support. 19th June, regimental orders, parole Drayton, countersign Page. General orders. The commanding officer of the artillery and the quartermaster general, also the town major, to attend at headquarters every morning at 7 o'clock, a complete return to be made, ascertaining the arms, accoutrements, and ammunition. Regimental, 20th June, parole Ferguson, countersign Washington. General orders by Major General Lee. As it now appears almost to a certainty from the intelligence of some deserters, the enemy's intention is to make an attack on the city, and as the general is confident that the number and spirit of the garrison will prevent their landing, it only remains to guard against the injury which the city may receive from their cannon. The Continental troops, provincials, and militia are therefore most earnestly conjured to work with not less alacrity than fight with courage. True soldiers and magnanimous citizens must brandish the pickaxe and spade, as well as the sword, in defense of their country. 1 or 2 days' labor at this critical juncture may not only save many worthy families from ruin, but many worthy individuals from loss of limb and life. On this principle, the general entreats the whole garrison, those on the necessary duties excepted, to exert themselves in forwarding the requisite works of protection. We've talked a little bit about this before, but as mentioned here, some of the men that are fighting this battle are soldiers sanctioned by the government of South Carolina, and some are militia who would have been paid, but not as easily as the soldiers. But the leaders are also asking everyone left in town to pick up weapons in case of an attack. The colonels or commanding officers of the different corps are to review the men's arms this evening at roll calling to take care that they are in as good order as possible and that they are furnished with good flints. For the future, the artillery officers are not, on any account whatever, to suffer a gun to be fired without apprising the general. The adjutant to attend in rotation as orderly, with an orderly man from each corps at the church to distribute the orders that may be from time to time issued. Orderly drummers are to be appointed at each regimental parade for the more immediate beating the different calls as the sergeant's orderly call, long roll for collecting under arms, and the general or other beats as the soldiers have been accustomed to, and they are to be informed of the different beats. Regimental orders, 24 June. The town guard to be augmented to 19 men, 2 sentinels to be placed at the stewards, 1 at the front and the other at the back door. Great care must be used by the guards as well as by the officer of the day that Mrs. Stewart does not make her escape. Lieutenant William Mitchell is to join Captain Beckman and his detachment at Sullivan's Island tomorrow morning. So we talked about this in the last episode, I believe, the last order book episode. Mrs. Stewart was Sarah Stewart, the wife of a loyalist who was also a loyalist herself. John Stewart, her husband, had already escaped to safety with the British in East Florida, and Sarah was being guarded at her home on Trad Street. John had been the superintendent in the Indian Department under British rule, and he was accused of gathering Native Americans to fight against patriots. Around this time, we have another perspective on all of this from Richard Hudson's letter book, which is also held in our archives. We talked about him in the last order book episode as well. He owned a plantation on James Island, which fronted both the Stono River and Wapoo Creek, just outside of downtown Charleston. And he was a fierce patriot. He was a member of the militia, but he was on his plantation at this point because he had been asked to prevent cattle from crossing the Wapoo Creek, so he was staying put there until the alarm for battle was sounded by the leaders. In a June 21st note to Captain Benjamin Stone, so just before this last entry in the order book, Hudson writes that he has administered the oath to every man on James Island in his charge, except for 3, which he would be administering to the next day. On June 24th, the same day as this order book entry that we just read, Hudson writes to his brother-in-law, Isaac Hayne, about the names and sizes of the British ships in the Charleston harbor, as well as the amount of men that the Patriots have in place on Hadrill's Point and Sullivan's Island, near where the British are landing on Long Island, which again is today's Isle of Palms. In a slightly comic story, he shares that 3 Patriot soldiers decided to take South Carolina President John Rutledge up on an offer of 30 guineas for every one of the king's troops that they brought back as prisoners. 3 Americans went over to Long Island, with 2 going off together and 1 going off by himself once they landed to try and capture some British. Later, they spotted each other in the dark and pointed their weapons at each other, each group thinking that the person they were facing was a British soldier. The group of 2 men shot and injured the one who was on his own. Still thinking they were going to be rewarded for their prisoner, they dragged him quickly back to the boat before they realized their error. The injured man was treated, however, and was expected to survive. 27 June, General Orders, Parole Macintosh, Countersign Polk. As the general is desirous to see how expeditiously the different corps can repair to their different alarm posts, he apprises the garrison that the drums will, this afternoon or tomorrow morning, beat the alarm. On this day, which we know in the present is the day before the Battle of Sullivan's Island, Richard Hudson writes a letter to Robert Gibbs saying that the American soldiers on Sullivan's and the British soldiers on Long Island fired a few cannonballs at each other. one of which exploded near President Rutledge, who was visiting the Patriot troops at the time. He also noted the arrival of a new American ship in the harbor and wondered if it could cause a suspension in hostilities. 28 June, Parole Hancock, countersign, Virginia. Minutes before 11 o'clock this morning, a bomb ship threw a bomb of 13 inches diameter into Fort Sullivan, which fell upon the magazine there but did no considerable damage. At the same time, the Bristol of 50 guns, the Experiment of 50 guns, the Siren of 28, the Action of 28, the Active of 28, the Solvay of 28, the Sphinx of 20 guns, and the Friendship of 26 guns all weighed anchor and, drawing up their courses, bore down to Fort Sullivan. A pause to explain a little bit of that quickly. All of those names that I just listed off there were British ships that had been stationed in the harbor. So the order book is noting that these ships, with all of their different numbers of guns, have now pulled up anchor and are headed straight for Fort Sullivan. The fort fired as soon as the two 50-gun ships came within distance, and the Siren, which there made the first line. They immediately dropped anchor with springs on their cables and began a smart cannonade, which was returned with coolness and deliberation from the fort. The second line of frigates supported the first, and an incessant fire was kept up until 11 o'clock at night, when the ships, as well as the fort, ceased firing. The first because they had been much shattered and had the following numbers killed and wounded. Bristol, on board of which was Sir Peter Parker, Commodore, lost her captain's arm, 44 killed and 30 wounded, and all her masts tore to splinters, and she prodigiously holed. The Experiment had 57 killed and 30 wounded, and her captain killed. Active had her first lieutenant killed and 1 eye and cheek shot away. Solvay, Captain Hunt, 2 killed and 4 wounded. Action run on shore. Sphinx lost her bowsprit and otherwise much damaged. The thunder bomb beds were shattered and she's unfit to continue the bombardment. And the latter because they had no more powder. The loss at the fort was but 10 men killed and 22 wounded. So wonderfully did God appear in our behalf that the men of war cut their cables in the dead of night and stole away to their old stations to refit. And the Americans emerge victorious, even though they were not expected to be. If you remember, the fort on Sullivan's Island, known today as Fort Moultrie because of this battle, was not quite finished when the fighting began, and the power of the British Navy was known around the world. This relatively small contingent from South Carolina was not thought to be able to outpower their opponent, and their victory would have ramifications through the generations. William Moultrie, who led the troops despite General Lee's poor opinion of his battle plans, would become a hero. The fort was built with palmetto logs, which turned out to be a great defense against cannonballs, and that's why the palmetto tree is featured on our state flag today. Moultrie's troops also fought under a flag with a dark blue background, a crescent shape, and the word Liberty, and our state flag strongly resembles that flag. And you can still visit Fort Moultrie when you come to Charleston to learn about its first battle. General Order 29th June, Parole Sullivan, countersign Moultrie. General Lee thinks it his duty in the most public manner to return his thanks to Colonel Moultrie and his garrison for their brave defense of the fort in the late attack, as likewise Colonel Thompson and the corps under him for their spirited and gallant behavior in preventing the enemy from making good their landing on the east end of Sullivan's Island. This morning, the Action was fired upon from our fort. The enemy left her and put fire to her, and by night she was burnt down. If you're confused here, the British basically set fire to their own ship because it had run aground and couldn't be pulled out. So rather than let the Americans get to it and use it somehow or be able to get ammunition from it, they just let it burn and cut their losses. Regimental Orders 1 July. The men of Captain Beckman's and Captain Drayton's companies are to be practiced at the 4-pounders behind the lines every morning. Saxon and Curl of Captain Beckman's company are to be ready to go to join the detachment at Sullivan's. This day, General Lee visited the garrison at Fort Sullivan, and when the regiment there was drawn out with a small detachment of the Corps of Artillery, he at their head returned them thanks for their gallant defense of the fort against a fleet of 8 men of war and a bomb during a cannonade of 11 hours and a bombardment of 7 hours. That tells us a little more about the timeline there. the more specific timeline than was listed in the original account of the battle. Mrs. Barnard Elliott, the lady of Major Elliott, complimented the 2nd Regiment at the same time with a very elegant pair of colors, delivering the following words to the regiment, who with rested arms received them. Your gallant behavior in defense of liberty and your country entitles you to the highest honors. Accept these 2 standards as a reward justly due your regiment, and I make not the least doubt, under heaven's protection, but you will stand by them as long as they can wave in the air of liberty. Some of this entry may sound familiar if you've listened to one of our past episodes. We did an episode last year on Susanna Smith Elliott Carnes, who at this time was the wife of Major Barnard Elliott, who would lead the 4th Regiment, which this order book belongs to. If you haven't listened to that one yet, go back and do it because she is interesting. But essentially, she presented the 2nd Regiment, who was the main regiment in this battle, with 2 flags to honor their victory. One was a dark blue color like William Moultrie's flag, which also had an influence on today's state flag. You can see a replica of that flag that she created on display at the South Carolina State Museum in Columbia. Later, Sergeant William Jasper would die a hero's death protecting Susanna's flag, as the soldiers promised to do. And that's who this next entry is all about, because he also protected Moultrie's flag in this battle. 4th July, General Orders, Parole Edwards, countersign Jasper. This Jasper was enlisted by Captain Elliott of the Grenadiers of the 2nd Regiment in Halifax County, Georgia, as a common soldier, but his extraordinary sobriety, his punctuality, and readiness in obeying all orders while a private recommended him to his captain a proper man for sergeant. Accordingly, he appointed him to that office in October last, while he had the command of the battery at Fort Johnson. On the day of the engagement between the King of England's fleet and Fort Sullivan, where he is with the company and the regiment he belongs to, he signaled himself in the following manner. The flagstaff being shot and the flag falling to the ground in the heat of action, Jasper called to his Colonel Moultrie, "Colonel, don't let us fight without our color." "How can you help it?" replied the colonel. "The staff is gone." "Then I'll replace it," said Jasper, upon which he leaped over the Sergeant McDaniel of Captain Eugee's company, a good and brave man, having his stomach and bowels shot away by the cannonball, and called out in these words. Before we get to Jasper's quote here, I want to note that some of the words in the order book have been turned away, so it's not a complete quote, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Called out in these words, "Fight on, my boys, don't let liberty expire with me today," which animated the soldiers that they fought, if possible, with double fury, took the flag and tied it to a sponge staff and stuck it up on the merlin of the bastion next to the enemy, gave 3 huzzas in the dangerous place he stood, and retired to his gun where he fought with his gallant company to the end of the battle. The President John Rutledge this day returned his thanks to the Sullivan's Island garrison for their gallant conduct and behavior in defense of that fortress, and taking his own sword from his side, presented it to Sergeant Jasper, and no doubt he will soon compliment him with a commission. So quite a performance there for Sergeant Jasper. But now that the battle is over and it's won, the soldiers are still not resting on their laurels. They're continuing the work of defending the city, and by extension, the whole state. The officers of the different guards are to take care that the sentries of their respective guards do not expose themselves to the sun, that those who have no boxes stand under trees or in the vestibules of houses where they are placed. The Quartermaster General to examine what number of axes are in town, that the different regiments may be set to work in making palisades. He is to give in a return of them as soon as possible to Brigadier General Howe, who will, as soon as the axes are procured, task each regiment with a proportionable number, as it is absolutely necessary for the good of the service that every regiment should be acquainted with making fascines and gabions. Gabions were woven basket-like structures that were filled with stones and dirt, and fascines were bundles of sticks tied together. These 2 items would have been used to construct trenches that would protect soldiers when they were fighting battles. The Quartermaster General is directed to collect 50 hatchets and send them to the hornwork, where the workmen are to assemble at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Sentries are to be placed to prevent their being stole. This work party must carry their breakfasts with them, as they cannot be suffered to return before the hours of dinner. The officers commanding the guards round the town are to give their sentries charge to stop all persons coming into town or passing the lines. It's not till the sergeants or corporals take them to the officer of the guard, either to pass them or refer them to the main guard if they appear doubtful of being spies or cannot give a proper account of themselves. Sentries are not to allow any person to be climbing on or over the works thrown up around town to trample or throw them down. The people to be allowed only 3 hours every day to pass and repass to market without the lines, and every boat coming to market must be examined by the officer or the sergeant of the adjacent guard in order to prevent spies or suspected persons from coming into town in them. They are really on guard to make sure that no enemies get into town, make it into their inner sanctum. A lot of work going on. 5 July 1776, General Order Parole Lee, countersign Liberty. Regimental orders. The quartermaster must take particular care to have the hospital well cleaned and fumigated with vinegar or sulfur, and the sick who were lately removed are forthwith to return. This will be seen to by the officers of the respective companies, and that the barracks are kept remarkably clean by the fatigue of the regiment. And so we'll leave it there with the sick in the hospital. The battle has been won, but there is still work to do. And we'll see you right back here next month. In the meantime, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or check out our website, schistory.org.